Hi, everyone. Kelly Deutsch here, and welcome back to Spiritual Wanderlust. Today, I have joining me Tamisha Tyler. And Tamisha is a theologian, an artist, and a lover of people. She's the co executive director of Art, Religion, Culture, also called ARC, and is passionate about African American culture and literature. She's also a PhD candidate studying theology, culture, and ethics. And today we're here to talk about theopoetics and the intersection of theology, art, and embodiment. And I'm really excited to pick your brain, Tamisha. So welcome. We're glad to have you.
Thank you. Glad to
Yeah,
be here.
wonderful. To get us started, Tamisha, would you share a bit about how you came to be so passionate about this intersection of theology and art? Were you always passionate about both?
Y- yes and no. I think I always say that I started out with the spirituality of my mom
Hmm.
and the things that she taught me. She always tells me this story growing up about how when she was pregnant with me, she was at a revival. She comes from Pentecostal background, and that she received the gift of the Holy Spirit while during her pregnancy.
Hmm.
And for people of Pentecostal tradition, it's often followed by evidence of speaking in tongues. And the revivalist, the pastor who was leading the service that night, gave her a prophetic word, but also gave me a word in the room. And the worm was that the words, knowledge and wisdom, all the days of her life were written across my forehead. And so that was just the formative story growing up for me. So it was really interesting because it was both grounded in a deeply spiritual experience, but it was about this sense of like wanting to seek knowledge.
Hmm.
And so I think that that was the beginning seeds of shaping kind of my trajectory. I was always a deeply spiritual kid. I would always want to go to church. And even if my family wasn't going at the time, like my mom would send me off with like the neighbor Christian who would always go. Um, but I was also deeply creative. So I began writing poetry in elementary school. And so poetry, especially, and other forms of art, were deeply was a way that I learned to articulate like who I was.
Hmm.
But I was also grounded in a deeply kind of spiritual sense. So I always kind of embodied the intersection before I knew how to name it.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't really learn about the word theology until college. And I think when I heard it, it made the most sense because it was like, well, I love God and spiritual things, and I love school. So it just makes sense that there's a thing that I can do both. I'll just do that. And initially, I put it on the back burner because I was really discouraged when I first discovered theology because I was a woman. And so I was discouraged by a lot of the men in the church. And I just kind of served in ministry. And then it wasn't until, wow, I want to say quite a few years, almost a decade later, that I actually, that idea came back up for me. And I was like, why did I forget about this? And I just decided to pursue it. So it's theology, especially, has always been kind of there. I think the arts just comes from me being an artist, um, me having a deep care for artists and for creatives, and knowing and understanding that an artist can give you more than just the product that they create, the way that an artist sees the world, um, the way that an artist kind of lives in and feels the world. It's something that I think is deeply embedded in us, and we often need help tapping into. And I think artists, um, and the way that they live their lives and the way that they help us to enter into those spaces are absolutely necessary. And so I always knew that one, that was something that I would advocate for, but two, that also required a deep caring for artists, right? You're in a very vulnerable space when you do that. And so who cares for you as you're caring for others in that way? And so that was just kind of I won't say I fell into it, but it was who I am. And so I just kind of leaned into that. And so
Hmm.
that's how I ended up here.
Yeah, beautiful. How did I'm curious what changed as you were speaking about theology and how you felt discouraged, especially by men in the church. How did that change so that you found this courage to follow the calling that you felt drawing you?
I just shared this with a group of students like a week or two ago. And it's funny because I said what changed was I told them, I said, I prayed a prayer that I don't recommend anyone to ever pray. And that's that, Lord, will you close every door that's not like you and open up the one door, that super naive prayer that, thinks that life works that way. But um, after I prayed that prayer, it's kind of like my life kind of fell apart. So the job that I've been working at, the company went out of business. So I was losing my job. I had this huge falling out with my best friend. I already had these questions about God and community and church that was not jiving well with the church that I was at. I'd been there for a while and there had questions, but I hadn't I think that there was something that kind of jolted me to go, wait, what am I doing? What are we doing? And, once you start asking too many questions, and it can become a real problem in some places. And so I was just in this, it was almost like everything in my life, including me, had been tossed up. And at the same time, there were actually quite a few people who were asking me specifically when I was going to graduate school. And these were people who didn't know I had an undergraduate degree. And so my friend was like, I mean, if they're asking you that specifically, and so, yeah, I dodged it for a bit. I was like, maybe I'll go and get a degree in screenwriting. And then I tried to write a screenplay and I was like, no, that's definitely a poet. Okay, maybe. And then somebody just said, hey, have you ever thought about seminary? And I was like, oh. And then all of that just came flooding back. And it was actually a pretty quick decision in retrospect. It was 3 days after I lost my job. I Googled seminaries in California, clicked the first one. They had an arts program. I applied 3 days after. And then a month after after my last day at work, I was in class.
Wow.
So it felt almost immediate. But it set me up for the rest is history, I guess, as they say.
Yeah, absolutely. I know I personally resonate with that trajectory of life falling apart and then something beautiful being reborn. And I think a lot of our listeners do too, because spiritual wanderlust doesn't really fit well within a whole lot of structures. A lot of people end up feeling like they're off-roading, and that can be a really intimidating place, especially when we've been taught to stay inside of our white picket fences.
Right. But I mean, that's just it, right? Like all of the fenced places and the roaded paved places were once someone else's wanderlust, right? And we're kind of just following the path that they found.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. I think that there's something extremely beautiful in that, just as much as it is beautiful to also be the off-roader and the wanderluster that goes off and create spaces for other people to then eventually maybe walk on and find.
Absolutely.
Which is awesome.
Yeah, I was just, I'm working on a program about women mystics, and I was just reflecting on how so many of the women mystics were such rebels and were so audacious in their day. And, would tell the Pope what was what, and, all sorts of really bold things, especially for, being a woman in the Middle Ages, many of them. But looking at 4 that I was looking at, Hildegard of Bingen, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, and Therese of Lisieux, those 4 became like doctors of the church in the Catholic Church, which means like, we hold you up above all saints as influencing our spirituality. But how in order to get there, they had to kind of push outside of those normal fences, what was accepted for them and what they were allowed to say or not allowed to say, and, just all that systemic fencing that we put ourselves in. So I thought that was kind of an interesting example of that. They pushed outside, but now it's something that's embraced and lauded.
I think there's so many of our saints and our leaders, especially Jesus, right? That had to push outside and were never received. What's the saying? Like you're not received in your hometown or something like that. But I think that also relates to time, right? Like we look at a lot of these people, we think they're beyond their time. It's like, no, they had to push through something right? So that we can say that that is our time, right? Our time that we think, oh, of course they should have thought that. We inherited from their rebellion, you know? And I
Mm-hmm.
think we forget that a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So you had these kind of two streams of theology and art, which maybe were really one after all. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious how you would define, for those who are listening, what theopoetics is, because those things intersect in theopoetics, but a lot of people haven't heard of it or think that it sounds like a cool term but don't quite understand what it is. So, how would
Yeah.
you define it?
Yeah, absolutely. So the ARC website, and just as a clarification, I no longer am the executive
Oh,
director
okay.
for ARC.
Thank
Just
you.
in case somebody is listening to this timeline and they're like, when did you do this video? But transitions happen.
Sure,
But
absolutely.
I still think the on the website has a really great kind of collective definition that I think was written about 5 or 6 years ago by some of the leaders. Um, in a paraphrase, it says that theopoetics is a art as a form or a style or a positive concern for the intersection of religious reflection or spirituality, right? The intersection of that and aesthetics and the arts. So it's a form, style, or concern for those two intersections with the focus on community, material change, and an emphasis on embodiment.
Hmm, that's a
And
lot.
so, yeah, there's a lot going on there. So, what I often say to people is that um, it's more than just writing poems about God or thinking through how art can be spiritual. It's about living in the poesis, the meaning making of life, right? What does it mean that we live into this way of being, this style or this form of being that takes seriously community and embodiment and material change and the arts? Those things are central to the way in which we live. What does that mean for us as people of faith? Or what does that mean for the way we think about religion or spirituality if those things are centered? Um, and I think it helps us to point to a certain way in which people have always lived, right? So theopoetics is not another way of doing theology, right? It's not like another theology. It just points to and acknowledges the ways in which we already live and says that is a point where you meet God too. I think a lot of this is to push back against the way in which we have created a pedestal out of certain forms of theology, like the systematic theology, right? For as an example, we have created an idol out of the intellectual enterprise of theology, and this reminds us that the embeddedness and the embodiedness of how we live into the world and how we make meaning of what is happening in the world isn't only an intellectual journey, right? It is the ways in which our bodies are implicated, right? Our community is implicated, right? It is the ways in which we learn to navigate change. Um, and I think Theopoetics takes that seriously. And it says we are using the arts exclusively, like explicitly, not exclusively, um, as a way to understand that. And I think even more broadly for the field of theology and the arts, and this is my thing that I say, um, a lot of the ways in which we've engaged the arts historically has been looking at what I call the artistic product as a metaphor. Let's look at how this painting tells us about, it's like metaphorically used to, right? And that's not inherently bad. It's just that we've kind of stopped there, right? When we think formally about theology and the arts. And I'm arguing, in a sense, that we should push into thinking through what I call understanding the artistic or the creative process as a spiritual epistemology, by like or a way of knowing. And and
Yeah, tell
and
me more about that.
one really great example is I was at a worship cohort in Michigan, and I made a new friend, and he is Canadian born, and he is Black and Indigenous. And so we'd had some conversations, and we were at one of the final sessions of this cohort, and we were sitting together, and we were listening to the speaker, and he was beading. He's making a necklace. He's beading. And I was just watching him, and it was just a really beautiful thing to watch. And I said, wow, that's really beautiful. And he begins to explain that each bead has a different meaning, right? And that the thread has a specific meaning, and that the act of beading this thread with this particular bead meant a certain invocation of a particular memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the necklace then was a reminder of that process. And so I had talked about, our spiritual epistemologies and arts the day before. And I said, this is exactly what I mean when I say artistic process as a way of knowing. Like the process that you are doing and that your tribe and your culture has like taught you how to remember, that process is doing something, right? It's a certain type of knowing that you have that isn't solely only linked to the product, right? The product is a reminder of the doing. And I think in a lot of ways, we focus so much on the end product that we miss that the process has been telling us something all along. And the product is just can just be a reminder of that process. Now, this is different if you are a reader or a seer of a particular type of art, right? Like you're having a different conversation with it because you didn't make that art piece. But I think that for people who don't do a particular art form or don't feel like their art is not their vocation, like the practicing of certain arts helps us to learn. One of the ways I really love this is have you ever seen what they call a Buddha board?
I don't think so.
It's like a canvas, and it's blank, and you only use water, and it has a little paintbrush, and you can paint on it, and it makes all the different shapes, and then because it's water, it fades away. And it's meant to be a meditative practice of letting go. And I think that is also just another beautiful example of being able to create something and then watching it fade, and then letting that process, the witnessing and the participating of that process, represents something that maybe you need to let go, right? And so I think that there are ways that we can lean into these practices, right? Practices and rituals that we may already do in our lives, right? There's a reason why so many people sat down to watch Netflix or to do something during the pandemic, right? There's a reason why so many people lean into the arts during the pandemic. It fed something in people, right? People recognized that they needed it, and they recognized that something about creativity and the arts was the only thing that can fill it. They necessarily work more, right? They were in their community. They were, more aware of their body, right? They're more aware of the arts. And so it's kind of like when we're in a certain level of pressure, we recognize that these things are necessary. But when things seem to be thriving, we somehow translate that those things are secondary now. And so I think, and I hope that a space like Theopoetics can remind us that those things are central, and that those things are important for us to understand who we are spiritually, in addition to emotionally, and like in ways that we're living together.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I, first of all, I resonate with that idolization of the intellect, and I think anyone who's alive today is kind of a product of the Enlightenment, or at least is influenced by the Enlightenment somehow, where we're just so focused upon the intellect, our heads. If it's rational, can I argue it? Can I be logical about it? Instead of looking at these other expressions. And it makes me think of, in my theology undergrad, talking about the difference between, some of these, oh, sorry, did we blip out there?
You froze a little bit right after you said, can I be logical?
Oh, sure.
And I didn't know if it was you or me.
Yeah, whichever. We'll figure it out. I was just thinking of how central it is, the day-to-day life, and how back in one of my theology classes in my undergrad, we would talk about the difference between like a theologian or a scholar who, studied all of, the systematic, breakdowns and definitions and explorations and philosophies, and sometimes eventually made it to this kind of open-minded, wide open space, and how that was almost painstaking, over decades, this big process. Yet how the simple farmer in the field knew those same wide open spaces interiorly just by sowing seed, and reaping the harvest. And we were like, which one's wiser? Like, I don't know. Like, they're different approaches, but there is something that feels so relieving to think like, oh, we don't have to go the route of the intellect in order to have like a profound spirituality or to connect with God. Like, you don't have to use the path laid out for you. Like, this is how you must believe.
Right. You don't. And I think that that's part of the focus on embodiment for me, because I think that, your brain is a part of your body, right? Like the way your mind works, like it is a part of your body. And I think that we forget, right? Damn enlightenment. I think we forget that is like, we think that it's a thing that's so completely separate. And it's like, it's a different thing. Yes. Is it separate from you totally? No. Right. And I think that there's maybe a healthy dose of integration that we need to come back to so that we can understand how those things can work together. Because I think that like, yeah, both of those trajectories to get to that place may be necessary. Maybe the person who ended up being the scholar didn't, in the context that they were in, didn't have a space to understand the sowing of a seed, right? They didn't have the space to really get their hands dirty, as it were, in that way. And because their gifts, their this, their whatever, lend it to more of an intellectual thing, they went and they read the books and they did the things, and then they're like, oh, I came to this place. I think that that's beautiful. But I think the problem is that we honor that person over and over. Like we put that path on a pedestal to the point that we downplay someone like the farmer who can say, I went out and I sowed a seed and this is what I discovered. And I think this is teaching me something about how to be more human in the world and about what does it mean to be a person of faith. And then they just share that, and then people go, yeah, that reminds me of da da da. And the nerd, me, right, can be like, that reminds me of this one book I read about the thing. And he's like, oh, that reminds me of that one crop we had, where there is generative space for us to be able to do that, right? And I think that a lot of the times we forget that as a scholar and a person who is completing a PhD, I think that we forget that I do this because I want to teach, right? Part of that is I am going and learning and reading all these books and doing all these things. So then I have tools to share with my students as they're on their journey. And then I can say, that was a really great insight. There's this, you should read this, or I watched this movie, or I did this thing, to give you also tools and to help you, right? To be the guide as you're on your own intellectual like discovery about something. That's the vocation. And I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think that there are certain ways in which I am preparing to be in that space, right? Just like a farmer has to get up at God knows what time in the morning to practice and do that. So then they can be like the guy, but it's like to nurture the crop to their point of growth, right? It's different trajectories. But I think that there is something to be gained in both, definitely.
Yeah. Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking about how the art for the farmer is very similar. It's like he comes out with this end product, like here is whatever, a pumpkin, and we just ate a delicious pumpkin pie. But to take the time to enjoy that as a spiritual act and look at all the things it took for you to get this pumpkin pie in front of you and savor it in your mouth, and to think of, the months of tilling the soil and of watching it grow and, fertilizing and eventually harvesting and then shipping it across, to think of like all the people and the efforts that went into that. I have a friend who's a painter, and she was describing to me, she describe for me Jackson Pollock like I've never heard before. He's famous, for his splatter paintings, and I never really thought anything of them. I'm like, can't anybody splatter paint like on a piece of canvas? Like I just didn't know. And she's like,
Mm.
it's not the paint itself. It's like the actions that he took. Like he was often in a harness, like flinging paint in all these different directions. It's the dynamism and the movement that's in it. That's the art piece. It's not what you see hanging on the wall. And
Mm-hmm.
that changed so much for my perspective of art. Oh, the act is what we are holding up. It's not simply like, wow, you make things look real pretty, you
Yes,
know?
and it resonates, right? Like when you look at certain pieces of, especially abstract art, like it's not about making out what the thing is. It's about I can see the movement. I can see the emotion. You have articulated it in a way that I can now enter into that space,
Mm,
and it has captivated me.
mm,
And so I would like to continue to enter into that experience. That's why we purchase art, right? You look at a piece and you go, oh, it still makes me feel this. It still
mm.
draws me into this, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that the intentionality that is put into work like that really does translate. And I think, I'm not saying that you're saying this, but I do want to also make a note to say, like, we always want to be surrounded by really beautiful things
Mm,
too, right? It does something to us, right? The way we adorn ourselves, right? The way we adorn our spaces, right? There's some kind of calming and an energy that happens to us when we walk into a space that we feel is beautiful or aesthetically pleasing. And I think that, there's nothing wrong with that. That's how we're made. And, I think that that is something that we can lean into, right? The beauty of it all.
mm,
Um, this is especially true, I think, in just my own cultural heritage, right? African Americans, Black people in America have been creating these beautiful celebrations that are not without the truth of 400 years of oppression and suffering that we have been undergoing in all these different ways. But that don't mean we don't celebrate,
mm,
right? And we don't make beautiful things. And, we don't laugh and we don't do, it's like, it's more beautiful, not because it's in spite of, and sometimes it is, but it's because it doesn't always negate that beauty.
mm.
Like we learn to live with both as we are fighting against a certain injustice, right? As we are sitting in the realities of death and murder and all of these things. And I think that, like, that's life, you know?
Mhm.
And everybody deserves to be around something beautiful.
Mm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. Finding ways to live into that both and, I think that's a beautiful example of that. The
Mm-hmm.
beauty and the pain and suffering. It all exists, coexists in this wild world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? I've been super curious about this. So, my background is Catholic, and we have this term that we use, and I don't know if it's used in a Protestant circles as well, so you tell me. We talk about this term called the sacramental imagination. Is that something
Mm.
you've heard before?
Uh, I feel like it is something I've heard before, and now I'm kind of questioning myself because I was like, I'm wondering if I read it in a text that was written by a Catholic.
Sure, sure.
So
Well,
yes.
yeah, let me describe it a little bit also for our listeners here. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious how that overlaps with or relates to theopoetics. So, the sacramental imagination has to do obviously with this idea of the sacrament where a material thing makes a spiritual reality present, so we think
Mm-hmm.
of the typical ones like, okay, baptism, it's not just a symbol of water, but this material thing of water makes present the symbol, the actual reality of like cleansing or making us part of God's body, etc. But when you extend that to the entire world, that it's not just the seven official sacraments, but that all of reality is sacramental, and that, you know, huckleberries and paperwork and like the homeless lady who lives by your workplace, or mosquitoes, just like everything in existence is teeming with divine presence. And that idea, some people call it panentheism, God in all things. And, that's where you get like the Flannery O'Connors or the J.R.R. Tolkien's, or,
Mm-hmm.
the Gerard Manley Hopkins, where they just, everything is possessed, shot through with presence and with meaning, and to be able to look at the world in that way, that our bodies, our soil, our food, everything makes present the divine in some way. That I think also informed, all the, Renaissance art and architecture and music and, all those things that came about. And I'm curious if that is an element of theopoetics, or if that feels like a separate thing or
Mm.
alongside it.
No, I don't think that it feels like something that is separate from that, or even alongside. I do feel like that is deeply resonant with what the tenets of theopoetics entails for
Mm-hmm.
me.
Mm-hmm.
I think because we are looking at this deep sense of like materiality, right? Uh, our own embodiment, our own ways we live in the world, and we're centering that and asking, you know, what does it mean about religion, God, spirituality now that those things are central? Like
Mm-hmm.
those very, like that's exactly the questions that Theopoetics pushes and asks, right? And it reminds us, remember, you're not only this, there's all of this other things, right? God didn't create only you,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's all these other things that, were created. I do also want to say, I think we had talked about this either over email, um, that in my research and in looking at like the field as we know it right now, was originally, a lot about Christian renewal. I don't think that, and I think that quite a few scholars may say this also. I think that theopoetics is about spirituality and religious reflection in regards to those things. I don't think it's only about spirituality and Christian religious reflection.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there then opens up an avenue for other religions and spiritualities that center those things to go, okay, what does it mean then if the arts, imagination, aesthetics, embodiment, if those things are central and integrated, what do we think about God or the beyond or deities or what or people or how we live in the world now? What
Mm-hmm.
changes, right? Um, and so I think part of my encouragement to people who are on a spiritual walk, and I mean, it also looks at the ways in which a lot of people are deeply complicated, right? Especially now with everything going on, you'll find people who have a deep love, for Jesus, but also are, engaging in different religions or who are borrowing from different things and who are a lot more complicated than, the categories that we have drawn on religion anyway. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that Theopoetics honors that
Mm-hmm.
as a lived reality, right? Because it starts with the body and it
Mm-hmm.
starts with that experience. And so it's like, well, where do you meet God in all these areas? Where do you meet beyond in all these areas? Or maybe you don't. Maybe you don't believe that there is a beyond and you're trying to figure out, you know, what does this mean for the human condition?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What does this say and demand? Less demand, but in some ways, yeah, the ways we care and honor one another,
Mm-hmm.
right? What
Mm-hmm.
changes about that? Um, so yeah, but yeah, I think that the sacramental imagination, I do not know what that was, or if you can hear that, but that was very loud. Uh, I do not think that the sacramental imagination is dissonant of what a theopoetics is. I think it sits right within that, and it says that God was here. It's kind of like, you write in the tree and like on the piece of paper, like you just want to know that you're known here. It's like, God has done that. I believe that, like as a Christian, like God has done that.
Mm-hmm.
And we get to find those little pockets of, God was here. And what does that mean for us?
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about embodiment in your own journey with that. Like,
Mm.
how do you feel like embodiment and that concept and how you live inside your own body has changed or developed over the years?
Yeah, it's I have had to be extremely aware of my body for most of my life, being a Black woman in America,
Mm-hmm.
being a plus size Black woman in America,
Mm-hmm.
right? My body is always present, whether I want it to be or not. Whether I have control of how it is present or I'm fighting for control of how it is present. It is. And it is very like
Mm-hmm.
palpably in the forefront of my mind. I think that history, right, has deeply affected the way in which I think about God. And because the way in which I received an understanding of God came from a very particular place. It wasn't didn't have like a deep spiritual otherworldly connection. It was my mom, who was a single mom at the time of 6 children and had to figure out all the things and wasn't perfect, but lived this deep spirituality, and it was us singing gospel songs, but also cleaning the house at 6 in the morning on a Saturday, right? It was always deeply embodied, right? Whether or not she was like, we are going to do an embodied exercise to remind our bodies that no, she's like, get up and clean and listen to Mahalia Jackson over and over again. Like, that just was life. And so
Yeah.
bodies have always been important and present uh, for me personally.
Mm.
Um, I think the notion of bodies and starting with the body, one of the things that, and doing, uh, Dr. Melanie May says, doing theology in the body, right? And
Mm.
not just about the body, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a lifelong practice in which you kind of lean into, and I even lean into this with some of my art. There's what is the name of that painting? It's probably called The Resurrection because it's a painting of the resurrection. It's at a Duomo in Orvieto,
Mm.
and it's a
Mm-hmm.
fresco. I always say words wrong. Um, and I can't remember the artist, but I remember seeing it in Orvieto, and it's this huge, beautiful painting, and it's of the resurrection. So people are coming out of the ground and they're,
Mm.
being, lifted up into God. And at the time, the artist thought that, everybody who was resurrected will be resurrected at 33. They were all, extremely fit, and they were all white. And I remember coming back and writing an extremely short poem
Mm.
about that, which was a response to what I saw in that painting. And it was entitled When I Rise. And I think I can remember it because I don't actually remember if I wrote it down.
Mm. Yeah.
um, and it goes, when I rise from the dead, I will still be fat. My teeth will still be crooked, hair kinked, skin black. And it was just a way of writing myself into that narrative. Now, maybe that's all the people that artist was surrounded by. I doubt it, but you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like it was in a sense of, if I die and I rise from the dead, I think wholeness and healing when going to Jesus is more about what size I am or what skin color I am or how I look. I think that Jesus is in God knows exactly what size I am, what skin color I am, and how I look. I think if anybody knows, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not going to become something I'm not when I rise. And if I have to become something I'm not, is that a place I want to go?
Mm. Yeah.
Right. And I
Yeah.
think that
Absolutely.
really helped me to think through both theology, the arts, and my own embodiment and writing myself as I am right now into that story.
Yeah. Mm.
And so I think that that's been like my own trajectory in that.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Would you like to share any other poems with us? I know you've been writing
Oh,
since you were a kid, and I love that kind of expression of the soul, because I feel like in spiritual things, we so frequently are dancing around the ineffable. And
Mm,
so art and poetry and music and movement and all the things that Theopoetics is about sometimes seems to do a more adequate job in saying the things that we can't say.
hmm I'm trying to think, I think I will read this one. And I'll say a couple of things before I read it. So this poem that I will read, which is called Who is God, was actually an assignment in a creative preaching class that we were supposed to write like something about who is God. And I ended up writing this poem, and I think I had a B because I think the professor wanted me to write.
So you got to be because the professor wanted you to write.
Yes, I got a B because the professor wanted me to write, I think, these bigger kind of universal statements about God. And I didn't do that. So I will read it to you so you will know what I did. And then also I will say um, that this poem explicitly uses the masculine pronouns for God, because that's where I was. I think I was just still learning and unlearning a lot about the ties between masculinity and God. But I never changed it because one, it was really where I was as a student, as a person, and I was learning and unlearning. So I wanted to honor that space. And two, because in many ways, for me, looking to God as father was a necessary thing as I and my father were healing our own relationship. And we're like super great now. But I think that there was some of that I needed. And so as a person who explicitly, wants to honor that God has created all genders and that God isn't necessarily connected to a particular gender, I also want to honor my experience and how I made my way through that trajectory. So I kept it in masculine pronouns.
Yeah,
Are you
absolutely.
for okay? So I will read it, and it's called "Who is God?" And I won't be looking at you, so hopefully neither one of us freezes.
Sounds good.
Okay, who is God? At age 5, he is the best answer for Sunday school questions. At age 8, he is the person you give your life to, although the lady called him Jesus. At age 13, he is the only one who will listen to what you have to say. At age 16, he is the last word you use when cursing and the first name you call on when you're about to get into trouble. At age 18, he is the voice that consoles a broken heart. And at 20, he is the grace that gives you room to forgive yourself. From 22 to 25, he becomes the reason for your hatred, the basis on which you claim your judgment, and the source of your pride. But at 26, you realize he was none of these things, and you wonder if you ever really knew him at all. So at 28, you set out on a journey to find him, like a child obsessed with capturing their parents' shadow. And at 30, you realize that the sun is east, the day is new, and he was right beside you all along, and his shadow constantly propelling you forward into newness. He is the mystery of your life simply because he is the only thing that makes sense. He is your foundation. Whether recently rediscovered or newly found, I cannot say. But he is the only support strong enough for your ambitiously ignorant, insightfully blinded steps that you carelessly choose to take. And although there will be many names that you will call him, in the many years that you continue to discover, he is and always will be God.
Mm.
And so that was my, obviously, semi autobiographical, if you can tell. But I think it was just my own, the only way I knew truly how to articulate God in that assignment was to articulate the ways that I encounter God in my life.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
I can say all of these really big, large things that I believe. But if you ask me who God is, I have to go back to what I've experienced in my body and in my lived experience.
Mm.
And I can tell you, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, an exercise in theopoetics in and of itself, just like I don't
Yeah,
go to the doctrines. I go
right.
to what I've lived and what I know in my body.
Yes, and this isn't, this isn't our thing with us. This is womanist theology. This is mujerista theology, right? This is the theologies of the people who are on the margins, who lived and who breathed this, right? This is the kitchen table theology, right? This is the Sunday morning with gospel music theology, right? Um, it is the day in and day out lives in which people find their faith. The doctrines are resonant of a history of that, right? They rise up out of the ways in which we have lived, and we go, yeah, that's right, because of what you experienced, and not the other way around, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we forget that because now we have these codes, we have these things, and then they become the thing that everything is to live by, right? But we're just, you know, we're kind of all guessing here, right? Like
Right.
Jesus came down and gave us a life, and we're gonna throw that away for some doctrines, really? Really?
It's true. I know. The first time, I can't remember if it was during college or after college, that it struck me that theology is like philosophy. Like, it's pretty clear in philosophy that there is no one right philosophy. Like, the
Hmm.
meaning of human existence, like how we make sense of the world and our experiences. And to think that theology there's like one right way to believe or to talk about God or to how we define God. And I'm brought back to some of those examples. Thomas Aquinas was one who wrote just
Uh-huh.
tomes and tomes of like definitions of the scholastic theology. And at the end of his life, when he had this profound mystical experience of God, he wanted to burn it all. He's like,
Mm.
it's all straw. He was like, all of my words do not suffice to speak of this one experience that I've had. He's like, I tried pointing towards it, but.
Right. And that's all that we can do, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's all we can do. We can try to find ways in which we can faithfully articulate what it is that we are experiencing. This is what the people in the Bible did, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is their ways of faithfully articulating their encounters with God, right?
Yeah.
With a couple of embellishments, but I mean, that's neither here nor there. So it's just it's what we always do. It's what we will continue to do. Let's just be honest about it.
Mm.
There's something deeply beautiful about that trajectory. I say, even in my own dissertation, and some people will be like, "You said what?" I said, at the end of the day, my dissertation is focused on Octavia Butler. I go, theology is speculative fiction,
Mm.
right? It's speculating faithfully in community, right? When you think about all of the histories of, the creeds and all this stuff, a lot of it was us reacting to arguments, or this person said this, and we're like, oh, now we got to clear this up and get together and figure out if they, and then we got creeds. And now we follow them faithfully as if God's self came down and was like, all right, so this, not that, but this and not. No, it's just faithful speculation and community. And that's
Sure.
holding true to what is still true for us right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what is still resonant about who we know God to be.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean about how we live in the world? That's all we're doing.
Yeah,
It's a lot more complicated than that in many ways, but at the end of the day,
sure. But I love that that also respects the mystery of God, that God is not something. If God were something that we could contain, I don't think it would be a God worth believing in.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So to be able to recognize like there is an ineffability in the midst of like that profound closeness, but there's something beautiful and freeing about that when we respect
Yes.
that
And it doesn't
mystery.
invalidate what we know,
Right.
right? It doesn't invalidate our encounters.
Mm-hmm.
It says
Mm-hmm.
yes and, you know?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. We will endlessly know the divine. Yeah. Beautiful. Well, as a final question, I'm curious if there is either a question or a piece of wisdom you would like to leave with our audience and those who are listening today.
Hmm. Yes. I've been thinking about this with a couple of people, and it just came to my mind. So, um, we talked a lot about like wisdoms and the history of wisdoms and upholding wisdoms. And I talked a lot to friends who often ask the question about, like, if you were to go back to your younger self, what would you say? You know,
Mm-hmm.
I have inverted that question because I like to invert questions. And I say, if your younger self can say something to you now,
Mm.
what would they say? And also, who would they be? Who is that younger you, right? Everybody has a different younger you. And the reason that I say that is we often tote wisdom, we pedestal. And I'm always like trying to knock down pedestals, apparently. We always tote wisdom as like this extremely important thing, and it is. And so we think that because we have more age and more experience, that in the history of our lives, when we go back to our younger selves, we have something in which to tell them.
Mm.
And we don't let them speak and tell us
Mm.
anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that I say that, and the piece of wisdom that I will leave, is wisdom is extremely valuable and powerful and necessary for us. But the question that I leave, and the question that I think our younger selves are asking, is what is wisdom without wonder?
Mm.
What is wisdom if all we know is to hold on in rigidity to the wisdom in which we think we've received, and to lose the wonder that God is there in the first place?
Mm.
And so, my question to all of us and me is to think about, what piece of wonder can your younger self give back to you?
Mm. Lovely. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful. I'm looking forward to wandering and wondering tomorrow.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yes, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Tamisha, for joining us and for sharing some of your reflections and wisdom about both theopoetics and your own story and your poetry. That was lovely as well to be able to experience firsthand and see what theopoetics lived and embodied looks like. So
Yeah,
thanks so
thank
much
you
for joining
so
us.
much for having me, Kelly. It's been an honor.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone too